As one historian once said, all the problems of the Russian Empire began in the nursery. If the Russian people had found out that the heir, the only male child in the family, had a debilitating condition that could kill him at any time, that would have been very, very politically dangerous for the Russian throne. So it had to be a secret, so much so, Nicholas didn't even tell his mother. He didn't tell his sisters. It was the big state secret.
I think the upper classes are living this sort of quite empty existence. They need something to excite them. And they also need some kind of spiritual grounding. And along into the midst of this comes Rasputin.
By the end of the 19th century, by the time Alexei is born, the autocracy is under pressure from various quarters, sort of liberals demanding a constitution, socialists demanding a revolution, nationalists demanding the dissolution of the empire. So in this moment of kind of political uncertainty, a public acknowledgement of hemophilia would have been understood to be a very dangerous move.
Rasputin grew up in a village called Pokrovka, which was pretty remote. I mean, it had a dirt road leading down the middle. There were buildings on either side, single-story buildings. It was a very, very basic place. There was no school. There was a church, there was a tavern. That was pretty much it. Even when he was young, he seems to have had this reputation as having a kind of second sight, as being able to see inside people's minds. I don't think it was purely a magical reputation. I think it was already at this young age built on the idea that he was some kind of holy agent, that he had this ability to channel God, if you like. There are quite a few possible reasons why he left Pokrovka. Certainly it's possible that he was already in trouble with the law, that he'd been thieving, that he'd been fighting, that he'd been drinking, and he kind of had to go. That's perfectly possible. But there's also a definite streak in him of restlessness. He wanted to wander. It seems he had some kind of religious calling, certainly a genuine religious belief, and the sort of life that would have suited him was the life of the religious wanderer. Now, this was already a phenomenon in Russia. This idea of people who had the Holy Spirit in them, who would just get up and go and would wander around Russia living on charity. And this is what Rasputin chose to do. One very important event in Rasputin's life, which I think was very formative for him, was when he stayed for a period in a monastery. He didn't stay very long there because he realized very quickly that monastery life was not for him. It was too confining. It meant that he had to conform to other people's opinions, to other people's rules. That wasn't Rasputin at all. But one thing that really did appeal to him there was he met this hermit, a very holy man called Massacre. And this man had been a sinner, basically. He lived a non-spiritual life and then had settled down as a hermit. And what he basically showed was that you could be a holy man, a spiritual man, having sinned. More to the point, I think it showed that you kind of needed to sin in order to be able to live a proper spiritual holy life. If you didn't know what it was to sin, you couldn't be redeemed, you couldn't be properly holy. And of course that fed right into Rasputin's narrative, because Rasputin was a man with a huge appetite for life, a lust for life. He enjoyed having sex. He enjoyed being a sort of big physical presence in the real world with other people. And what Macquarie told him was, not only is that okay, it's important. If you don't know what it is to sin, how can you be a truly spiritual person?
One of his huge passions in life, apart from making revolution, was walking in the Alps. So people often thought, well, why were all these places in these groups in exile in little old Switzerland? And it was largely because a lot of them were like walking in the mountains. Lenin wanted to create a revolution leading to a socialist society that would abolish exploitation, abolish private property, and held all ownership in common. Other communists wanted workers to own their own factories and peasants to own their own land through communal ownership. What Lenin wanted was everything owned by this organization that was going to lead the working class, the vanguard of the working class. So everything would be run by the party. This is a bit of battle in how you organize a socialist society, all the way through. Just who ultimately does own it. Lenin by then is one of the leaders of the revolutionary left. The secret police in Russia have been extremely efficient in getting rid of socialist revolutionary groups. That's when Lenin began this nomadic, exiled life of an underground revolutionary party set in Munich, in Paris, and London, moving around where the Okhrana's reach is less great. London was much easier because the police didn't cooperate with the Russian police. Lenin lives in exile in London for 2 years, and very early one morning there's a knock on the door. And it's Leon Trotsky, who's just escaped from Siberia.
Trotsky's a farmer's son from agricultural Ukraine. But what they identified quite quickly, by the time he was 9 years old, that he's a once-in-a-generation intellect. Luckily for him, they're wealthy, they have money, they can afford to send him to an elite school. From an early age, he was writing speeches, he was writing pamphlets or getting things in school, newspapers and journals, especially at university, so that you could go back to his very early teens. He was very much on the cusp of wanting to be involved in the national debate. Trotsky's political life started once he got to university in Odessa. That's where he was studying philosophy, but his studies were secondary to actually being involved in political debate at university. He became very well known for his fiery speeches and primarily his intellect. He had very good arguments to give. It was the style in which he could write pamphlets. It was the kind of energy he brought to any kind of debate, which led then to coercing workers in Odessa, railway workers, to actually protest and go on strike. He's now a target. He's gathering a name to the point where the authorities do want to clamp down on him. He's been arrested. He's going to go into exile. And that's where he's coming into contact with the writings and the name of someone like Lenin. So in 1902, Trotsky escapes Russia, gets out to the West and would end up in London. And that's where the name Trotsky comes from, because he used a fake passport from his original jailer in Odessa, who was called Leon Trotsky. When he's arrived in London in 1902, there are a lot of Russian exiles and revolutionaries, and one of which would be a man that would shape not just the politics, but the life of Trotsky, and that is Lenin.
That's their first meeting, knocks on the door, wakes him up before breakfast. They spend the whole day together just talking about politics.
They instantly got on, and it was a real meeting of minds. They spent hours and hours debating the kind of politics they wished to bring in, the kind of society they wished to build. They were on the same road, Trotsky and Lenin, in terms of, well, this is the kind of thing we do want to have, but their paths would slightly separate in terms of how was that going to be achieved.
The party is set up, the newspapers run, then occurs the biggest split. The one that created, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks.
Bolshevism was led by Lenin, and that was the radical side of this split in the factions in terms of what Bolshevism was about was seizing power, fomenting revolution, establishing control within the country that they hoped would be home in Russia, and then effecting radical change.
Lenin wanted a very tightly organized group of which demanded 24-hour-a-day utter loyalty.
The other side of the argument was the Mensheviks. Yes, they wanted change, but the change that would come would be more gradual than Bolshevism. So you've got these two semi-ideologies clashing against each other. What Trotsky wanted to do was trying to navigate a path that would bring both sides together.
It's not really about ideas, and it's not really about organization. It's about rivalry. It's about who is going to be the power. But even the split and the wording and the language used shows a big element of why Lenin was going to come out on top. It all comes from one particular resolution about party structure, and Lenin wins the vote. Lenin could think in headline terms. Lenin could think very strategically in very, very simple winning terms. Bolshevik is the majority, and Mensheviks are the minority. Now, who starts a political party calling itself the minority? So he called himself the majority, because winners call themselves the majority.
When the engagement of Alexandra and Nicholas became apparent at the Coburg wedding, where Queen Victoria was reigning, she accepted the fact that they truly, truly loved each other and that she couldn't stand in their way. But she looked upon Russia as what she called an unsafe throne. And she had told Ella, Alexandra's sister, when Ella married in 1884, "I would not wish a Russian husband on any of you four Hesse sisters." Russia was turbulent. There was a growing revolutionary movement, political assassination, left, right, and center. The Queen was fearful.
I don't think that Nicholas enjoys office. He does ascend the throne with a feeling of duty, but not with a feeling of great excitement.
Alexandra had this very arrogant view, which she explained to Queen Victoria. I don't need the Russian people, to make myself visible. They accept my husband's divine right as Tsar to be loved and obeyed and adored. And she really didn't think she needed to make herself accessible to them in that kind of hands-on way that Queen Victoria did.
The revolution really begins the 9th of January 1905 when a priest, Father Gapon, leads a procession of workers towards the Winter Palace bearing icons with Nicholas and saints, because they want to submit a petition to the Tsar to sort of, protest their working conditions. So very much this idea that Nicholas himself has of the common people, that what they really want is an unmediated relationship with the Tsar father figure. They don't want to have to deal with ministers and government inspectors. But troops panic and open fire on the crowd. The estimates are around about 200 people are killed, hundreds more are injured. So it's a terrible massacre. His own standing, the standing of the court, has been very badly damaged in the Russo-Japanese War, and then you've got this terrible political crisis unfolding in your own capital. The violence continues. There is a general strike in September 1905, and that's the point where, as Prime Minister Sergei Witte comes to Nicholas and basically says, you have two options. You either grant a kind of constitution, or you send in the troops, but if you send in the troops, I'm not sure it would work anyway. So that's the choice. So the point is that Nicholas is dragged kicking and screaming to this point. He does not want to grant a constitution. He does not believe in parliaments or the sovereignty of the people. He believes that he should continue to rule in accordance with the dictates of his own conscience. But he is finally persuaded. He grants a Duma, which is not a parliament, crucially. It cannot make law. It is a consultative assembly where government legislation can be discussed by representatives of the people. So it's an elected assembly where the government can say, we're thinking of doing X, what do you think about it? And the representatives of the people are allowed to say. It's still essentially an absolute monarchy. It's not quite as absolute as it was, but power really still resides with the throne. So the Duma doesn't really have political parliamentary teeth. What it does have is a kind of public influence, because it provides a forum within which deputies are now able to stand up and deliver speeches which can be critical of government policy or critical of the Tsar. But Nicholas, he is not a supporter of constitutional monarchy. He humiliates the Duma when it is first convened. He refuses to go to the Duma. He insists that they come to him. The first piece of legislation that he gives to the Duma to discuss are plans to build a laundrette in a girls' boarding school somewhere in provincial Russia. The whole attitude is that he has, in a moment of weakness, made a concession that he is now trying to kind of claw back.
When Rasputin moves to the capital, to St Petersburg, it's so completely different. It's the most sophisticated part of Russia. It's very close to Europe. But it's also a place which is suffering a kind of identity crisis. Russia is moving away from its sort of agrarian past, its feudal past, if you like. It's moving towards this sort of modern industrial future. And it's kind of lost. It doesn't know where it is. I think the upper classes are living this sort of quite empty existence, this sort of vacuous existence, as they're sleeping with each other, they're going to exhibitions, they're doing this, that, and the other, but they've done it all. They need something to excite them. And they also need some kind of spiritual grounding. And along into the midst of this comes Rasputin, with his piercing blue-grey eyes, with his strange hair, with his strange peasant clothes, with his total lack of any social graces, with his ability to talk to the upper classes as though they're just peasants.
At the time Rasputin came to prominence in the early 1900s, the Russian aristocracy had been experimenting and flirting a lot with the occult, with seances, with gurus and faith healers and anything kind of a bit oddball. They were very open-minded to that kind of alternative world. And that's why he was adopted by a kind of groupies, aristocratic female groupies, who clustered round him for the pearls of wisdom that he dropped, and who began to believe that he had the power of some kind of faith healing, auto-suggestive power. No one's ever really explained it.
It was all the rage in sort of aristocratic circles, sort of seances and Ouija boards and, you know, communicating with the dead and theosophy, and there's this sort of heady concoction of different mystical religious practices and ideas that are sort of swirling around. But I do think that within the Orthodox tradition there is a kind of reverence for holy figures who are sort of almost like the holy fool. I mean, someone who is blessed with a religious wisdom, and these are individuals who are not necessarily ordained priests.
So when Rasputin arrives in St Petersburg, he's kind of this whirlwind, but at the same time, he's not an unknown. He arrives with the backing of important bishops. So he has credentials, but at the same time, he's unlike anything that these people have seen before. Rasputin met these two sisters, Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro, who were not particularly popular amongst the other elite, but both these women were married to cousins of the Tsar. So now Rasputin had entered a sort of rarefied atmosphere. And it wasn't very far from there to the Tsar and Tsarina themselves.
When Nicholas and Alexandra were first introduced to Rasputin in 1905, it was very much as a sort of wise guru and healer and man of God. It was not as a miracle worker. They were always interested in exploring their spiritual life and meeting people, and they were very taken with Rasputin, and Nicholas's initial reaction was to him as a man of God.
When Nicholas and Alexandra meet Rasputin, they meet him in the grip of a revolutionary crisis. I mean, he's a monarchist, Rasputin. I mean, he's all in favor of the Tsar needs to be the Tsar, don't worry about these reforms. So he's telling them the kinds of things that they want to hear, but he seems to be this sort of representative of the common people. The common people are beyond the palace. They are rioting and attacking gentry estates. This chaos is unfolding, and here suddenly is this individual who is going to help us explain, you know, what's going on, and is telling us the kinds of things that we really want to hear, because he reinforces our own views of the Russian peasantry. The timing of the meeting really matters, because they are in a moment of acute political crisis, but also personal crisis because of the diagnosis of hemophilia in Alexei.
I think one of the most important things, the thing everybody knows, in fact, about Rasputin, but still is really important to stress, and was a big influence on people at the time, was Rasputin's looks and his physicality. He was incredibly dramatic looking. You know, he made a big impression on everybody he met. There was something else about him which is interesting. All the photographs of him show him being very, very austere, staring at the camera, very, very serious. But when people met him, he wasn't really like that at all. He was actually quite fun. He was quite light-hearted. He would tease people. He would smile a lot. When he met someone he recognized, he was incredibly happy, he was joyful. None of that comes across from the photographs. He had a way that made people want to befriend him, or made them want to be important to him.
The first really significant episode in which Rasputin offered advice and supposed healing to Alexei came in 1907 when Alexei had an accident in the park. I think he banged his leg and he had a bout of serious bleeding into a joint. And Alexandra remembered that they'd met this wise guru healer, Rasputin, a couple of years ago.
Rasputin was called, he stood at the end of the bed, he said prayers, and the boy recovered. You can imagine the sort of effect this had on the Tsarina.
He basically came, stood at the end of the bed, said a prayer or two, said, "Don't worry, everything's going to be okay," and went. There's no mystique about it. I think the key with Rasputin is that he had the ability to calm, this sort of auto-suggestive power to calm Alexandra. If the mother's anxious, the sick child becomes more anxious. There's a kind of transmission of anxiety. And by calming Alexandra and convincing her that everything was going to be okay, that kind of reassurance transmitted itself to the little boy.
It's a very interesting question, very controversial question, obviously, whether there was any science behind the fact that the bleeding stopped and Alexei improved. We acknowledge now very much that there's, a placebo effect. If people feel they're being helped, they often improve. And it's very possible that there's a kind of placebo effect at work here.
I have a theory on this, for what it's worth, about Rasputin's powers, and it's a very simple one. It goes back to a tradition within the Russian peasantry. Russian peasants had this gift, and it's called in Russian zagovarivat krov, to speak to the blood. And what it was, if an animal hurt itself and was bleeding or was in stressed state, the peasants used a kind of talking, calming method. It's a bit like horse whispering. I think of Rasputin actually as a people whisperer. And that's, I think, what he did. That was his gift. He had the extraordinary, sonorous, Old Testament kind of manner and voice, those incredible piercing blue eyes. He had a gift of calming the blood.
There were effects of this. So first of all, as far as the Tsarina is concerned, he can do no wrong. She must have him around now. He can keep her son alive. It's as simple as that. For Rasputin, this is great. It means he has the trust of the most powerful people in the Russian Empire. So far as onlookers are concerned, they don't know about the hemophilia, but what they can see is that this mysterious peasant is getting closer and closer and closer to the royal family.
The Romanovs referred to him as our friend. And this is the key to Rasputin's relationship with the Romanov family. You've got to remember they're at a time of increasing violent revolutionary activity. The Russian throne is threatened. There's a huge antipathy to the Romanovs. They have retreated within the confines of the Alexander Palace. There were very, very few people Nicholas and Alexandra trusted. And Rasputin was one of a very few people that they really admitted into their inner circle.
The children have a pet name for him. They call him our friend, which is, pretty intimate. He has names for them. He calls Alexei Olya. That's his nickname for Alexei. And people who observe them all together realize that they're very close. They're very natural with each other. I mean, Rasputin, bear in mind, is essentially a very simple person. He doesn't patronize the children.
He was their friend. He gave them advice, their wise guru. And when you look at the girls' attitude to him, particularly the older three, they even asked his advice. They wrote him letters. They were affectionate towards him. I wouldn't call him a kind of benign uncle figure. He was more of a sort of religious advisor, father, confessor, whatever you like to call him. But they certainly looked upon him as one of their few trusted friends.
Nicholas sees Rasputin as having a positive effect on his son's health, but also on his wife's demeanour. And, there is some evidence that Alexandra can be quite sort of strident and hectoring, and that Nicholas is quite relieved at the presence of Rasputin because he exerts a sort of calming influence on his wife.
He made that famous off-the-cuff remark to his Prime Minister Stolypin that he'd rather have 10 Rasputins than one of Alexandra's hysterical outbursts. So I think in a way he pandered to her neuroses to keep the peace.
Rasputin emerges for the royal couple as kind of a spokesman for the Russian peasantry. I mean, they believe that Rasputin's ideas, his advice, are a kind of window onto popular attitudes within the Russian peasantry, across this great empire. And so therefore he speaks with a kind of authority, that they take seriously.
Rasputin goes back and forth between his village and St Petersburg. So I think this is the kind of paradox that we see all the way through Rasputin's life. He's absolutely determined to build a relationship with the Tsar and Tsarina. Make no mistake, he's ambitious. He may be childlike and he may be kind of an open book in some ways, but he's got an ambition as well on a personal level. And when he's back in his village, he's trying to do good works. He's trying to give money to people, he's giving money for a church, he's doing, the other side of the Rasputin story. In the autumn of 1912, Alexei had another fall, another hemorrhage. The doctors couldn't do anything. Alexandra was desperate. Now at this point, Rasputin was back in Siberia.
When Alexei had a really serious near-fatal accident out at Spala in the Polish forest, a telegram was sent to Rasputin and he was very close to death.
All Alexandra could do this time was to send him a telegram saying that this had happened again. Could he help? He sent a telegram back telling her not to worry, that Alexei would be fine, and telling her to make sure that the doctors didn't bother him too much. It was quite a clever telegram, really, not only reassuring her, but giving a piece of advice. And a piece of advice that, meant that he was basically better than the doctors.
The telegram, when it finally got to him at Pokrovskoye, his old home village, actually didn't arrive till after the crisis had passed. Alexei had turned the corner before Rasputin even responded. And again, it was just a telegram back saying, don't worry, the little one will not die. I'm sure that Nicholas and Alexandra were aware of the gossip and dismissed it. There was an enormous amount of innuendo and titter about Rasputin. He was a very conflicted person. He was, on one side, extremely pious and wise guru, preacher, layer on of hands, whatever you want to call him. But there was a deeply dark, libidinous side to him that wanted to just kick over the traces, get drunk, have sex with as many women as possible, and live this kind of riotous, uproarious life.
There were so many rumors that started to fly around about Rasputin. And there's a lot to sort of unpack here. First of all, people were absolutely attacking Rasputin because he came to be this symbol of of everything that was wrong with Russia. It was driving it into the ground. This kind of conspiracy theory that you see about certain groups that come back again and again and again. You know, he became somebody who was the victim of this sort of conspiracy theory. However, it wasn't just him that was being attacked. It was the royal family very much. I mean, the royal family, you know, amongst many people was not popular. And the Tsarina was considered a foreigner. The Tsar was considered weak. So attacking Rasputin was kind of a way to attack the royal family without explicitly attacking the royal family. And let's face it, you know, people have said a lot about Rasputin on, you know, all sides down the years, but you've got to face it, he wasn't doing himself any favors with his behavior. So, you know, it wasn't as though, you know, Rasputin was this victim out of nowhere of these rumors that were accusing him of being dissolute. You know, he was absolutely helping this along. Rasputin has made himself indispensable to the royal family now. He's also really polarized opinion across Russia. Most of it is very anti-him. Things that are appearing in the press are extraordinary. In fact, he's so unpopular in many ways that he's done what nobody else could do. He started to unite the opposition to the Tsar. I mean, these are all people of such sort of wide range of beliefs and opinions that nothing could really ever bring them together, except for a bogeyman, or a supposed bogeyman, like Rasputin. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Rasputin basically tries to get in touch with the Tsar desperately. He sends letters, he sends telegrams, and he's begging the Tsar not to go to war. Now, this isn't on anyone's advice. The fascinating thing about Rasputin is that he's not interested in other people's advice, because God is speaking through him. God's telling him. This is why he's such a loose cannon. He's a terrible person to be giving advice, because it's not based on anything. I mean, it is. It's based on, you know, God's belief, but that just so happens to coincide with Rasputin's belief, which is based on very little. So at this point, he gives some advice to the Tsar, you know, really forceful advice. He says, if you get involved in the war, all will be lost for you.
I mean, he's surrounded by voices who are urging caution.
There's only one direction Russia can go in from here. And once the war starts going badly, it's hard to see any results coming but the end of the royal family.
They were still together. They were still a family. They had each other. They got through it.
He used to call him the Georgian.
As we would see later in his life, violence and using violent people and manipulating them and also terrorizing them became his modus operandi. Stalin, from the early 20th century, essentially balances violence, terror, and interpersonal relationships.